Well, hello and welcome. I am Guy Stevens with the Alliance Against Seclusion Restraint. You'll have to forgive us. We're running a few minutes behind today. We had some technical glitches, which hopefully we'll have fixed and we'll have no more during the next hour or so as we're bringing to you another great AASR Live. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Alliance Against Seclusion Restraint. If you're not familiar with who we are and what we're doing here, the Alliance Against Seclusion Restraint was started about 4.5 years ago. We initially began focusing heavily on things like the use of restraint and seclusion in schools across the country. Our mission continues to kind of grow and expand. And of course, we don't want to see restraint and seclusion happening, whether it be at schools, residential facilities, the troubled teen industry, medical settings, wherever it might be happening. We are really promoting better ways of working with all human beings, trying to move away from things like restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, and corporal punishment. Really trying to shift our approaches around behavior as well. You know, how do we do better when it comes to supporting people that are sometimes having a difficult time? So the Alliance does a lot of work around legislation and policy. We do a lot around education and, of course, individual support. So really happy to have you here today. And, of course, we always have, well, I think the best guest in the world. And, of course, today is no exception. Really excited about today's guest. Dr. Claire Cronin, who I'm going to tell you more about in just a moment here. But we're going to be talking a bit about relationships, and we're going to talk a little bit about child-teacher relationship training, which is something that I am really eager to hear about today. Of course, any of you that follow us frequently, you know how important relationships are. We often talk about the shift that's needed. It's trauma-informed, it's neuroscience-based, it's relationship-driven, and of course, collaborative. So excited to have our guest here, and I'm going to go ahead and bring up our guest and introduce Dr. Claire Cronin. So let me bring Claire. Hello there. There you are.
Hi.
And we are here now with no glitches, no echoes, no buzzes, and hopefully all goes well. So I apologize about the pre-show technical issues here, but really excited to have you here today. I'm going to tell folks a little bit about who you are, and we've got a really, I think, fun discussion coming up here. And I will ask people, if you're watching live, and I know I see a number of people watching live already, you know the drill. Let us know who you are in the chat. Say who you are. You can tell us a little bit about yourself. You know, are you an educator? Are you a parent? Are you a social worker? An occupational therapist? Tell us who you are. Also, tell us where you're from. It's always fun to see. We have people from around the world that will join in to these live events. Not to put any pressure on, but we typically have people from New Zealand or Australia, or Canada, United Kingdom, and of course, a lot of people here from the United States. So if you're on now, let us know who you are and where you're from. So let me tell you about Dr. Claire Cronin, who is a licensed mental health counselor, passionate about supporting resilient communities and training frontline care professionals on trauma-informed care approaches. Her exposure to restraint and seclusion was while embedded in a public school for children with behavioral concerns, where she witnessed firsthand the significant impact of these practices had on creating trauma and stress for children. And of course, you know, we all agree that trauma-informed approaches are important, but you've got to be really mindful that you can't be trauma-informed and at the same time subjecting kids to trauma, which can very easily happen. Then it says, since then, that you have been on a mission, and I can relate to that because I'm on a mission too, to support teachers and other frontline professionals in trauma-informed care through shifts in the philosophy of working with children and adolescents. And I feel like I need to stand up and say amen. Couldn't agree with that more in terms of your mission. So I had the opportunity to connect with you, and I think it was after an event, and I, was learning about child-teacher relationship training, and sounded like fascinating work. And of course, we often talk here about the importance of relationships, in trauma-informed approaches, but just the importance of relationships and human connection and how critical that is. So just want to start off by saying, Dr. Cronin, thank you for being here today and welcome, and happy to have you joining us.
Thank you so much, Guy. It's really wonderful to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited for our conversation over the next hour. And again, if you're watching live, tell us who you are and where you are from in the chat. And I see we already have somebody that's weighed in from Canada. And Sydney is a certified and approved EMDR consultant. So Sydney, thanks for joining us. And hopefully we'll have other folks let us know who they are and where they're from. But let's get started here. We talked about kind of having a conversation about this. And, the topic that we had here on your event is child-teacher relationship training. 7 skills for building meaningful relationships. And before we get into 7 skills, um, let's talk a little bit about what child teacher relationship training is. I know that, I'm sure that there's many people out there that have had similar experiences to mine where, I remember when my son was in school, saying, hey, this is a relationship kid, you know, relationships are so important to my child being successful. And, I also understand on the other side of feeling that's important is this tremendous pressure and number of priorities that educators are really facing every day in the classroom. And of course, after returning to the classroom following the pandemic, all sorts of new difficulties and challenges. And it's probably easy to feel overwhelmed and like, well, I don't have time for relationships. I'm putting out fires here. And I've often heard people say like, I just don't have time to make a relationship with all my kids. And often, kind of in reflecting, I think, well, there's probably one or two kids that you're working with that if you don't, you're not going to be able to help. So relationships are critical for supporting everybody. But why don't you tell us a little bit about what is child teacher relationship training?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to, Guy. Child teacher relationship training is based in child centered play therapy. So that is a modality that we've been using to work with kids and adolescents since basically the 70s. And it came out of the University of North Texas. Dr. Gary Landreth was the one that wrote the book on it. It's a really wonderful and developmentally appropriate way to work with children. That's very kind of humanistic. It's client-centered, and it really believes in the full capacity of children to grow and heal and change. And what's really kind of radical about it at the time when it was first coming out was that we didn't try to use adult skills with kids. We recognized that play is the natural language of children, and that if we really want to connect with children, we have to meet them in their world. And there's been lots of research, it's an evidence-based practice on how child-centered play therapy really works to help children heal and grow in the ways that they need to. And so the thought was originally was, we have all these great skills, the 7 skills that I'll be teaching you about today. We have these skills. Why don't we teach parents them so that they can learn to really be in deep relationship with their children? And the child-parent relationship training came out, and they did lots of studies around that, how that was a really positive influence in the relationship between parents and kids. It reduced power struggles. It increased a sense of connection. And it had all these other, outcomes that adults were worried about, which is like behavioral outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
that type of stuff. But it helped parents to feel truly connected to their kids. And so that was a big shift. And then we thought as researchers, why don't we move this to teachers too? Because who's in contact with kids the most other than parents? It's teachers. So it was adapted into child teacher relationship training. And I was very lucky to be part of a team at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where we got to do research on child teacher relationship training. I got to work hand in hand with teachers and learning the skills. And what was really interesting about that work and what they found with child teacher relationship training is the focus was on teachers. Like, how do we keep great people doing great work and reduce burnout and compassion fatigue? And child teacher relationship training really does that for teachers. It really gives them the skills so that they feel competent, so that they enjoy their jobs, so they know how to relate to children. And there's still lots of research being done around that at UNC, at University of North Texas, at the University of Wyoming. But it's just been a really successful model that is adaptable to many locations. And so the training itself really helps adults kind of reshift their mindset around what is it to work with children. Because oftentimes I think, my friends that are teachers, you're taught that when you work with children, you do to them.
Mm-hmm.
You teach to them. They can't exist and be successful without you. When really from the counseling world is that we know that children have this inherent tendency to grow, to change, that they, the child you meet today won't be the child you see tomorrow. And they're in constant growth. And that's the incredible thing about working with childhood. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of where child teacher relationship came from.
So you said, and by the way, now I know why I wanted to put you back in North Carolina earlier. We're like, you're in North Carolina, right? No, Colorado. So uh, I knew there was a connection there.
Yeah.
So you said that initial work began in the 70s, and the work that you were doing when you began to kind of bring this training to parents. Now, when was that work being done?
Well, parents, they rolled out in the 90s and early
Okay.
aughts,
Okay.
and really got a lot of evidence-based research around that.
Hmm.
And then the CTRT rollout has been happening probably in the past like 5 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Phyllis Post was one of my mentors, Dr. Chrissy Opiola. They're both at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And they've really focused on implementing it, not just in school districts with low behavioral struggles, but in school districts that have high poverty rates, that have a disproportionate amount of kids that are BIPOC or newcomers in urban areas and rural areas, because they really wanted to see, is this going to help teachers that work with some of the toughest populations? And it does. I mean, that's just what.
Yeah, and of course, as you described that, there's also a lot of trauma in the populations that you're talking about, in the locations that you're talking about, and of course, what we see very clearly at the Alliance is that if you look at the kids, and the way I often say is that the kids that are misunderstood, right? If you look at the kids that are often being misunderstood, very often in the name of behavior, we're often talking about kids with disabilities, neurodivergent kids, Black and brown kids with a trauma history, and of course, very young kids. But the prospects there are if you're a young child who is being misunderstood and having a lot of things done to you, versus kind of working with you, the outcomes can be really poor. I mean, we find a lot of kids that are being restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled, sadly, even still subjected to corporal punishment in some states. What we find is that, these are kids where school is not a safe place. School is not a friendly place. School is not a welcoming place. And guess what? If we don't feel safe and welcome, we're going to be less engaged. We're going to be more likely to drop out. And of course, we have kids that are moving down kind of that school to prison pipeline. And this work is so important. These relationships, you often hear people talk about how critical even just one adult relationship is in terms of, impacting a life. And, the focus. I mean, sometimes I think people think about relationships, and maybe there's the thought that, well, gee, I just don't have time for relationships, or it's not the priority, or school should only teach the the academics, which I disagree with so heavily I can't even begin to say. School is about raising human beings, and there's a whole lot that goes into that. But nonetheless, this is a foundational building block, and there are some kids that really need this to make a difference in their lives. But I think it's easy sometimes for people to minimize the importance of how much impact that relationship can have, don't you?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you really feel for teachers because they get pulled in a million different directions, and it's an evaluative relationship at the end of the day. And what we're asking for them to do as part of CTRT is to be not evaluative. And that's part of being in a really healthy relationship, is not being so quick to judgment, to being more curious, being more open, and to, really wanting to explore each unique child. And that can be tough when you have a classroom of 20, 25, 28 kids, but the big piece around this is we know that this type of approach really does make teachers' jobs easier, and it makes it easier for them to sustain their work longer, which is good.
Right. Yeah, and of course, relationships are important all throughout the fabric of any organization, whether it's a school, whether it's a medical setting, whatever it may be. These things that we focus on that are really important. So if we want to focus on trauma-informed approaches, we want to focus on relationships. These things are important not just for the people that you're working with and the people that you're serving, but to have those philosophies that are really kind of going through the fabric of the organization. So, I saw a comment here that said, well, same for educators. If they don't feel safe, they end up leaving. And of course, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. And the important thing is that, we need to be working on these relationship skills with everybody, with the other adults. And that's got to really be part of the DNA for an organization. So what does this look like? I know we're going to get to kind of the 7 skills, but
Mhm,
at a high level, what does this look like in terms of the training itself? So
mhm,
if you're working with a school, and you can tell us more about kind of where people can get training done, but
mhm.
if what does this training look like in practice?
Yeah, so it's really adaptable to the environment, to the school needs, but it highly focuses on working with teachers to learn each skill. And the ways that we've done that is, taking teachers off periods and meeting with them as small groups and having them work through each skill. Learn about the philosophy of child centered play therapy, and then getting them to kind of role play through it to get to test out the skills with each other. It's a very collaborative approach. We ask that teachers or other frontline professionals that are involved that they come prepared with a child in mind, that they can really think about, like, oh, how would these skills work with that child? In some school settings where we've had the luxury and the ability, we've actually had the schools set up a full playroom, which is, like what we use as play therapists, so that the teachers can go into the playroom with a child, have a quality 30-minute session with them, and use the skills that's in a setting that's very different than the classroom. Because oftentimes, if they get the ability to be one-on-one with a kid that is generally very tough for them to be around, they see them in a new light.
Mm-hmm, hmm.
And that's something that when possible, we like to do, but it's not a must. We also can operate these trainings in ways that are, week to week. We're meeting with teachers over the course of the semester. We can do them a little bit quicker, where we break them into several hour trainings under professional development days. And then a lot of it is kind of a mentorship opportunity. So teachers that are more senior, that have taken the training, that understand the skills, having them mentor teachers that are new to the skills and helping them
Yeah, and
with
that's one of
that.
the best ways to learn, right? I mean, when you begin to, kind of take that experience and teach back what you've learned, I've always found that to be invaluable to have
Yeah.
that opportunity. So, as you described a little bit about what child-teacher relationship training is, I'm getting a picture in my head that may or may not be a good picture. So, I want to ask you a question. So, you talk about play, you talk about, kind of the dynamic of, getting a child one-on-one, and now, what age kids might we be talking about here? And can these things, because very, very quickly I'm like, oh, well, this sounds like elementary school. But
Mhm.
what application does child teacher relationship training have when we're talking about middle school or high school, or what's? So tell me more. I mean, tell me more just
Yeah.
about kind of the kinds of children that might be appropriate for this kind of approach.
Yep. I've adapted this for middle school and high school youth. At my work at Together, we use this intervention when working with youth in our residential program. That's for 12 to 18-year-olds. The skills look a little bit different because with older kids, they do have more of that frontal cortex online, and they may be more verbal, or
Mhm.
maybe not. And so they may be more likely to engage in dialogue. But the nice thing about the skills is you can really take them and use them with adolescents. And it is all about reshifting the way we think that we engage with youth. We
Mhm,
think
mhm,
that
mhm.
oftentimes we have to sit and they need to talk to us, and it needs to be kind of this back and forth tennis match.
Right.
And that when we say to a youth, yeah, I get you, I understand, that that'll be enough. But really, what they're looking for is actions that
Mhm.
convey that I hear you, I care, I understand. Um,
I
yeah.
think about Mona de la Hook, and she's often talked about kind of serve and return, and you make the tennis
Mm,
analogy here, but she's not just talking about kind of words, not just
mhm,
talking about but it's about interactions. It's about when you're playing alongside of a child, doing something and them responding to it. And um, we had an opportunity recently. We were doing another event like this, and we were talking about improv. And I thought it was really fascinating because I saw the connection here with, because you think about serve and return, it's very easy to think about small children and how
mhm,
that might be applicable. And the same is true, I think, with child teacher relationship training. It's very easy to imagine the small child, but then what does this look like, for somebody that's in middle school or high school? And I'm
mhm.
glad you brought up, the facility that you work at Together, because I think there, no doubt, you're working with kids that are far different than we're talking about when we're talking about elementary age kids. So I think that's really interesting. I noticed your reaction when I said something about improv. Did you have was there?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think that that's such a key component of the
Okay.
work that we do with youth, which
Gotcha.
is like a sense of humor and playfulness
Right.
and
Right.
ability to kind of engage in that exchange with them, you know?
Sure, sure. Yeah, we actually had, and I don't know how familiar you are with Mary Dean Michelle, but she's got a book called One Rule Improv, and it really is about using improv as a trauma-informed approach to building relationships and connecting with kids. And again, this isn't just about playing alongside of a small kid, but it's ways to engage and do that, engage in that serve and return, and
Yeah.
kind of build that relationship. That's great. I want to pause for a second, just bring up that we have a couple of more folks that have weighed in here. We've got Shelly here from my home state, Maryland. I've also stressed to educators that my child first needs genuine relationships. Absolutely. And I love that word genuine. I've seen language used before like therapeutic rapport. It's not language I love. It really is about, and kids will see right through it. I mean, it's not a matter of pretend that you're showing an interest. It's actually, have an interest, have an opportunity. You said something earlier that sparked Stuart Shanker in my head, and a quote that he says often, and I think I've got a poster here, but it says, if you see a child differently, and that's something we do differently, you see a different child. And sometimes those opportunities that you're talking about seem to be where the opportunities are to make those kinds of connections. A couple more folks here. Let's see, Shireen from Charlottesville, Virginia. We've got Sarah from Rochester, New York. I got Ang from, let's see, Bellington, Washington. And let's see, somebody here from British Columbia, Canada as well. And of course, somebody here from the UK. So we've got a couple of people joining us from different places. One of the questions that was asked very early on, and this is always the question you probably anticipate, because when you begin to talk about relationships and you talk about play, and the question is, of course, how do you get buy-in? And people sometimes will look at things that are being done in the name of building relationship and building connection and building safety and go, oh, well, you're rewarding a kid, or these aren't things where we should be putting our focus. So how do you get buy-in from school administration for approaches like child-teacher relationship training?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's been interesting. The school districts that we've worked with, one in North Carolina came to us because unfortunately they were featured on the news for calling the police and having the police restrain children as young as kindergarten. And so they reached out to the university that I was at the time and worked with Dr. Phyllis Post, and she put together a team to help support them. So I think in some cases, school administration is in crisis. I think as you kind of alluded to, Guy, there's often a parallel between, school administrators or teachers feeling so fatigued, feeling so, burnt out that they're at a place where they feel defeated or helpless or hopeless. And I think a big part of child-teacher relationship training is instilling hope, instilling belief, giving people the capacity to re-envision themselves. Oftentimes, I think we make things overly complex when, as I teach you guys the skills are actually very simple, but they require a ton of buy-in and, like you mentioned, genuineness and capacity for compassion and empathy, which if you have staff that are burnt out or have compassion fatigue, you kind of have to start there, right? And so there's lots of really nice assessments that we've used in the past to help administration use to assess staff and their level of compassion fatigue, and helping, kind of that foundation of how do you support staff so that they will be ready to engage in a training like this.
And there was a comment that was coming up as you were saying this, and this really resonated with me because, wow, I think it's really challenging. I mean, in terms of higher education, there are a lot of gaps. At least I think there's a lot of gaps. I know when it comes to a lot of the punitive discipline, a lot of things like restraint and seclusion, a lot of the things that could be preventative aren't being taught in higher ed. And Calvier said teachers' colleges should focus on relationships. But yeah, I think that brings up the point that there sometimes are these deficits, these things that, as you're a first year teacher and have completed your program, things that you've not been given that really are going to be critical to helping you move forward.
Yeah. And one of the nice things is at University of North Carolina at Charlotte was they did do a crossover between the teachers college and the counseling college so that they could learn these skills and be part of it. So I think that there is some movement in the field that way so that people do have the skills to feel
That's fantastic. That's
equipped.
fantastic.
Yeah.
So before we get into the skills, because that's why we're here. We want to hear these 7 skills because at the end of the day, this can really help people to get ideas of things that they can do. Again, whether as a parent or as an educator, I'm going to ask you to really kind of boil down. If somebody were to come out of this presentation as we finish it and say, "Hey, I just saw this great presentation on child-teacher relationship training," if they were to try to explain to somebody in a sentence or two what it was, like the really high-level message,
Mhm.
what would you say? And again, I mean, I know I asked you earlier, like, what is it? And you gave me a great answer. But really boil it down. Um, how would you encourage an educator to sell their administrator on it or somebody else? How would you encourage them to kind of describe this?
Yeah. I always think, it child teacher relationship training has immensely positive outcomes for children and helps buffer trauma, helps them heal, helps them grow as children. But the more important thing that I think administration wants to hear is this is going to help with your turnover rate. This is going to help teachers feel fulfilled and equipped to do their jobs. And this is going to help you have more positive outcomes in the classroom where there's less, as they call it, behavioral disturbances. There's less opportunities to have to go hands-on or use restraint or seclusion. This is also going to help teachers because it's traumatic for teachers or any paraprofessionals to have to use restraint, to have to seclude children. And so the more skills we give teachers that are these skills, the more likely they are to stay in the field. Because in my heart of hearts, and I think that's the belief with child teacher relationship training is teachers go into teaching because they love children and they want to
Right.
be with them.
Absolutely. Well, it's really interesting, that you focused on that because that's something that we talk about quite a bit, which is the same things that you can do to reduce the use of restraint, eliminate seclusion, reduce the use of a lot of other punitive approaches, the same things that you can do to help you accomplish that and ultimately have better outcomes for kids do lead to better outcomes for teachers and staff. We see this. We see data that shows a school that eliminates seclusion and reduces the use of restraint. You know what happens? Teacher satisfaction increases, staff turnover decreases. We end up creating better environments, but often it's hard for people to make that jump. At least initially, they're like, "Well, you want to take these tools away from us?
Right.
That's going to make things much harder." But again, that tends to be what you see kind of in the long run. So I'm glad you made those points. So let's get started. Let's get started with 7 skills. And I'm just going to let you kind of start and run through them.
Sure.
And I'm probably going to interrupt you periodically. And of course, those of you that are watching live, feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. But let's go ahead and get started with, and I don't know, I feel like this is a top 10 list. Like, I don't know if we're going in backwards order, if these are in any order at all, but I will
Yeah.
let you take it away and run through these skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the order that they're in is really successive. So the key skill is the first skill, and it's always the skill that people want to skip over. And it's what we call be with attitude. And gosh, don't adults think that we have be with attitude? We're like, oh, yeah, we really understand how to be in relationship. No, we understand how to be in adult relationships, which are kind of this dynamic of like talking to one another, having these kind of very frontal cortex type of motivated interactions. Be with attitude is a mindset, it's a philosophy. Gary Landreth is very influenced by Carl Rogers. It's a way of being. It's a way of being curious, being open, using non-judgment, and being comfortable to be with the child that sits in front of you that very day. One of the core philosophies is that when we create an environment in which a child feels seen, heard, understood, that is when growth and change happens. And the metaphor that I like to use is why do leaves change in the fall? Like, why do the leaves on the trees change in the fall, Guy? If you just had to
Well,
take a guess.
I actually took botany, but it's been a while ago, and so I'm not going to go into that. But why do they change? Gases are released. I don't know what happens exactly, but
Yeah.
they change because there's a biological process that
Yep.
leads them to change. And in the winter, it's probably less efficient for them to have the leaves. I don't know. There's a
Mhm.
whole lot to it. I had to ask
Yep.
my son. He just started a forestry program, and he's
Oh, great.
he's doing really great in it. But I don't have a lifeline right now where I would give him a call and have a really good answer for you.
No, that was perfect. Yeah, usually people,
I
us
tried.
adults, we get like really work. We're like, oh, I don't know. There's a chlorophyll something.
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
leaves change in the fall because of the environment, right?
Right, right.
They change because the sun changes its tilt. They change because the temperature. Leaves don't change in the fall because there's something marked on the calendar that says, oh, this is the day when all the tourists come up for leaf peeping season.
Pumpkin spice latte, leaves changing. All those things that come in the fall, right?
Right. Yeah. And they certainly don't change because we tell them to change, right? We don't go up to our elm tree or oak tree and say, now's the day, you have to change. They change because of the environment. It's the perfect environment for them to change color and to fall off the tree. And that's absolutely true with children. They change when they are in the environment that is most supportive for change. And
Right,
that is
right.
not because adults shove or push or jam it down their throat that, darn it, it's time to change. So that is like what be with attitude is that, can I be truly comfortable with the child that is sitting in front of me today? And it's
Mm-hmm.
deep, deep work because we're asking us to accept in children what we may not accept in ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's really tough.
And I think the other part of it is that we also have to be mindful that children are not miniature adults with fully developed prefrontal cortexes in the same capacity and decision, the same kind of, they're not equipped in the same way that adults are, especially when we're talking about very young children. And sometimes we put very adult expectations on children, even when it
Absolutely.
comes to relationships. So what we're expecting in a relationship with a young child, it may not even really be developmentally appropriate.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Totally.
Yeah, your leaf reminded me of. I'm gonna get it wrong here, but what's the comment? The thing about like if a plant's not doing well, you don't blame the plant. You change its
Right.
environment, right? You move it
Yep.
to a different environment. So that's number one. Is kind of that be with. So it's
Hmm.
just that attitude that you need to be with kids.
Hmm.
And you said that was kind of foundational.
It's foundational. And it's
Okay.
got a lot of, we have to have a lot of multicultural competency around that too,
Hmm.
to be with children that might be from a very different background, different culture, different experience than we have. When I run this training, I've run it for after school programs that work with immigrant and refugee youth. There's one down in North Carolina called Our Bridge. And so we talk a lot about cultural competency and the ability to be curious about things and to really sit with a child that may be very different than you are, may express in very different ways than what you've grown up around, and just to be gentle and patient with that. And to kind of use that cultural humility model of like, I may not understand, but I want to understand.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that's
Hmm.
the first skill, the be
Okay.
with skill.
All right. Let's go on to skill number two.
Skill number 2 is tracking. So tracking is kind of like if you've ever watched a sports game, it's how the sports commentator may call a game over the radio. So it is something where if we want to convey to a child that I see you, I hear you, it's not by hammering them with questions and being like, "What are you doing? How's your day? What's wrong?" I hear that all the time with kids that are crying or look upset. Tracking conveys, I see you and I notice you in a very close way. And tracking is actually one of the easiest skills for teachers to use because you can kind of move around a classroom and you can just say, "Oh, Johnny, you're coloring that piece of paper." And you move on to the next child and you say, "Oh, you're working hard on your English homework." And it's just noticing what they're doing. I use it all the time when I go into our residential program at Together. When I walk into the room, I greet everybody warmly and then I just notice. I say, "Oh, you're working on that video game again. Oh, I see that you're baking something over there." It's just noticing what they're doing and saying it out loud.
And I love that it's noticing as opposed to praise, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I really do. I'm a big fan of Alfie Cohen's work, and I think the noticing is not putting value. It's just and we all want that. We all want to feel like we're being seen, and this is, I mean, really strategizing around like how do you help someone to feel seen? Well, you notice them.
Yeah, absolutely. And youth really like it.
Hmm.
Younger youth, you can do more tracking with. Older youth, you maybe just sprinkle it in every once in a while, but it just lets the youth know that you're really engaged with them. You
Hmm.
really
Hmm.
see them. So
Hmm.
that's skill number 2.
Okay. So, and of course, we're running through all of this, in an hour time. But assuming when you're training this, you're, not only talking about these principles, but really kind of diving into like, this is how you do it, and this is what it looks like.
Hmm.
Yeah, great, great. Okay, well,
Yep.
let's dive into number 3.
Yes. Yeah. We do lots of practicing because as you see, we move through the list. It's a very different way of talking to kids. And
Mm-hmm,
usually
mm-hmm,
adults are very uncomfortable with it at first, but then
mm-hmm.
they kind of come around. So the next skill is paraphrasing. And this is kind of what we've all been taught to do around active listening, summarizing. So it's, a child tells you a short bit of information and you summarize and say it back to them. So you let them know that you really heard them. They're telling you something important. It could be something mundane, something that adults don't think is important, but oftentimes for kids in their world, it is really important. So it's important for us to kind of summarize, grab a piece of it, let them know that you hear it, and kind of repeat it back to them. But it's not parroting. So parroting isn't saying, exactly what they said back to them. They don't want to hear that. Then they'll say,
Mm-hmm.
you talk funny.
Probably so. So, give me an example. What's that look like?
If a child comes up and says, I have so much homework to do, and then this kid and I got in a fight, and now I lost my lunch period, you'd say, oh, you got in a fight, and then now you don't have lunch anymore. And it's
Right,
just that
right,
easy.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, and feeling heard. Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right. So, and I'm just trying to keep track here myself. We have be with, tracking, paraphrasing. What comes next?
Yes, those are the top 3. And then we're moving into responding to feelings or motivation. And that one's, again, one that we think as adults we're really good at, but actually we're kind of culturally normed not to observe feelings out loud in a very direct way. And with children, the idea behind this is kids want to hear that adults see them and that their feelings are real and valid. And B, that we need to express to them the language that they may need in the future. So I've seen this oftentimes at school. A kid has been told to leave the classroom. They're sitting outside in the hall. As I walk by, I can see a child is crying. They've got their head down. They look like they're in distress. Instead of saying what usually adults say, which is, what's wrong? I say, oh, I see some tears there and you look really sad. And I give it a label. And I don't try to fix it. I don't try to change it. I just acknowledge the feeling that is there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're also not. I mean, sometimes as adults, um, we're really judgmental too. So here's a kid, and it might be like, well, I guess you're going to think next time before you do that, or saying things that probably go the opposite and push a child that is already upset into a state where they might be beginning to feel dysregulated.
Totally. Totally. And it's the key skill that I think every adult jumps over to is they want to go right to teaching and lesson giving and coaching. But if a child is really dysregulated, and I've seen it on some of your other shows, like the handy model of the brain, and their lid is flipped and they're in the big feelings, they're not going to hear you. They're not
Right.
going to hear your coaching. But what they will hear is a really gentle tone and somebody giving a short phrase of, I know you're sad, or if you have a really mad kid,
Right.
you are so frustrated. At our residential program, kids may be really frustrated because a parent didn't show up for a visit and they're stomping around and they're posturing and they're angry. And staff really wants to go right to, you can't kick the table, you can't throw the chair. But they don't hear that. What they need to hear is, you're so frustrated. Your mom didn't show up like she was supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Even listening to you say that and putting myself in the shoes of somebody that's in that moment having a difficult time. I mean, that sounds so much more validating. Of course, that opens the door, I think, to and really is I think really kind of a step into co-regulation, right? Which is where we really want to
Totally.
be heading. Sure. Okay.
Yep.
So moving forward, we've got be with, tracking, paraphrasing, responding to feelings
Mhm.
or oops,
Or
motivation.
motivation.
Okay.
Yeah. So
That
that's
okay.
another big one.
Okay. Okay.
So if you respond to motivation, maybe you have got 2 kids in your classroom and you can see they're starting to get escalated and they're frustrated with each other. And now the voices are getting louder, coming over and, one kid has done something to the other kid about taking a toy or something they really wanted. And you say, to the kid that's really escalated, you really wanted to play with that toy. Unfortunately, Juan is playing with that toy. So you're responding to the motivation. You really wanted that. You wanted to do something, that type of thing, which validates that they are not just behaving poorly out of nowhere, for no reason. It just shows that kids are, much like adults, they have the capacity to want and do things, and that's valid.
Right. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's go on to number 5.
Returning responsibility. So this one is a big one in building autonomy and independence in kids, building their ability to feel like they have the capacity to do things on their own. Oftentimes for kids, adults do for kids what they can do for themselves. And that really robs them of the opportunity to learn and grow and fail. And there was a really nice article actually in the New York Times in the past couple of weeks about increasing autonomy and independence for kids. And one of the principals said that after they had made a focus on that and returning responsibility to kids, that she saw less feet sticking out. And the writer said, well, what does that mean? Like they were tripping each other less? And the principal said, no, it was less kids asking for adults to tie their shoes. And this is exactly the philosophy behind that, is that kids have the ability to do for themselves and to think in creative ways that adults can't think of. And so oftentimes we'll see this as, you have a child that comes into your classroom and they say, I can't do this, or I need help. And it's something that they could probably try to do on their own. You say, why don't you give that a shot? Why don't you give it a try? Or I think you may have an idea about how to do that, instead of jumping in to do it for them.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to something you said earlier that resonated with me for a lot of reasons, but it's the idea behind this is it's not about doing things to kids. It's not about doing things for kids. It's about doing things with kids. And that seems to me to be such a foundational approach to working with anyone, but kids in particular. For what it is, there's sometimes very different values put on children. The idea of childism. The idea that we look at children differently than we almost look at children as not being deserving the same human rights, which can be seen by a lot of the things that happen to kids. But this really is about like doing with and not doing for or doing to. And don't we all do better under those circumstances, right? Don't we all do better when people are working with us rather than doing things to us or even doing things for us?
Yeah, and it conveys such a strong message. Especially as an adult, like when somebody says, can you do this thing and can you take care of it? And I really feel like, oh, I can do it. That relays to me that people believe in me. People know that I can rise to meet expectations. Even if it's small things, it feels really good for kids to have the opportunity to do it their own way. And that means as adults, we have to be comfortable with the creative ways that they may come up with to do things.
So how then do you handle the situation where in doing that, in kind of setting up to say, let's return responsibility, knowing that there are, well, let me try to phrase this in the right way. We've often seen situations where a parent, a teacher, a staff member looks at a kid that is not meeting their expectation in some way or another and goes, I know they can do it because they've done it before. But of course, that brings up an entire question. We actually had a little piece on this recently about kind of the idea that our capacity fluctuates, in any given day, any moment of time, the stressors that are affecting us, a lot of things can affect our capacity in the moment. So what do you do if the kid can't do it at that point? And how do you then transition to that?
Yep, absolutely. And that kind of goes back to the be with attitude. Because if you're really being with a child in that moment and you can see that they're having a struggle that day, they've had a rough day, and they really don't have the kind of emotional capacity to deal with the distress of trying that new thing again, with that be with attitude that, okay, maybe it's time for me to do it with them.
Right.
We give it an effort together.
Right. And of course, these steps are not a linear journey, right?
No.
These steps are things that might have certain foundational elements like being with, But, at any point it might be like, hey, let's go back to this paraphrasing. So here, after, the child expresses to you why they can't do something right now, maybe that's a moment that you paraphrase, or maybe something that they say is something that you kind of use that tracking, approach with.
Absolutely.
Okay. Gotcha. Gotcha.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, returning responsibility is not something to like foist upon rugged individualism onto
Right.
children, like they've
Right.
got to bootstrap themselves up to the next skill. But it is to look for these micro opportunities where we don't jump in. I see it oftentimes with highly anxious children that they'll
Right.
shut down, they'll say, I can't do it, that type of thing. And adults will do for them what they can do for themselves in the smallest ways. And it robs them of the opportunity to kind of tackle some anxiety, for kids that have suffered through a lot of trauma or abuse and neglect, they may feel really helpless. And if we perpetuate that by continually doing things for them that we know that they could do themselves, at the residential center, we often talk about like just helping them to learn some life skills around cooking for themselves, but doing it with them, not for them,
Right.
is really empowering for them, because
Yeah.
making a meal in a place where you don't have food insecurity, that can feel really good for kids,
Yeah, I would also think kind of that, again, back to returning responsibility, being mindful of, kind of can't versus won't.
Mhm.
Very often as adults, we look at things and go, well, this child's refusing, this child won't do that. And there are moments in time where we all can't do that.
Yeah.
We can't meet the expectation. So I think, having this foundation and this, set of approaches that you can use, and knowing when to fall back, right? I mean, knowing when to,
Yeah.
okay, well, yeah, this is not, you can't do this right now, and that's okay,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
Great.
And
So
moving into, we'll do it together.
there you go. So that brings us to number 6 then.
Yes, and that's esteem building. So this kind of goes back to what you had mentioned before. Esteem building is about recognizing the efforts of children instead of kind of praising or being super evaluative. Kids know that there's two sides to a coin. So if you're one of those adults that gets into a pattern with a kid that says, "Good job, way to go, you're doing the best, you're smart," that type of stuff, they know that there's a flip side to that coin. So if they aren't having a great day, if they're struggling, they know that an adult can switch over to, "Bad job, you didn't do the right thing, you're not a great kid, you're acting
Or that
bad."
your love or approval is contingent upon them doing well, right?
Totally.
Yeah, yeah.
Totally. So esteem building is noticing the efforts of children. And this one is also a really nice one to use in the classroom, because you can go around while children are working independently or in small groups and saying, "You're working together with them. You're lending your pencil to that child. I can tell you're working hard on that."
Right, right. But not followed by "good job, you get a star."
Right,
Right,
exactly.
right.
Which is
That's
a big
great.
shift for a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah.
professionals and teachers. They really want to, they think that, kind of that external motivator is what gets kids to do things, when really
Right.
that's not true.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the research actually shows the opposite, that it kills intrinsic motivation when you begin making
Totally.
everything relying on that.
Yep. So esteem building is just noticing efforts. It's also noticing, I have kids that come in and they will be the experts on a subject, and they will tell me all about World of Warcraft or Pokemon. And instead of me being like, "Wow, that's really cool, you're so smart," I say, "You know so much about that,"
Mhm,
or
mhm.
"You really took a lot of time to learn about that." And so it's really responding to them in a way that says, I see the efforts that you've put in around that. Not that it's good or
Mhm,
bad, but I
mhm,
see
mhm,
that.
mhm. Well, it's interesting you say that. I was having a conversation with a colleague recently, somebody that I know and respect quite a bit, and we were talking about this idea that that there are times where you need to empathize with people, even if you don't necessarily agree with where they are.
Yeah.
That there's a value, and there's a value in kind of empathizing and hearing and listening. I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything they're saying. I thought, well, that it actually really makes a lot of sense when you look at it in that, in that way. I mean, listening, providing, the things that you're talking about, you can have differing opinions, but still we want to be heard, we want to be valued, and there's another time sometimes to go in different directions with all of this as well. But in a situation where somebody's having a hard time, they need that connection, they need that support.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting because, like I was talking about before, we're used to a very adult way of dialoguing with people. And sometimes kids will come up, and I've seen adults do this. Kids will tell them all about that thing that they know a lot about or they feel the expert on. And adults roll their eyes and say, oh my gosh, I have no interest in that whatsoever. And they've missed a really key opportunity to connect with a child and to say, you know so much about that. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah. No, it's unfortunate because not only have they missed that, but they've actually missed a lot more. If that's kind of the response. Couple of quick comments here to get, and we'll then continue down the list. Sydney says adults in schools and group homes should be co-regulators, if not all the time, most of the time. Great content here. Dana said these are great practical strategies that can be used in the classroom for all students. Yep, agreed. It just takes prioritizing relationships as a foundation for creating a safe learning environment. And I think even beyond that, as I reflect on that comment, one of the things that I think about is something we talk about a lot, which is it's about compassion and connection, not compliance and control. But we often end up in situations where the thought around the classroom is all around behavior management and compliance and control, and we're missing that really important part, because when you build these relationships, the child that may have been having a difficult time and may have been having big behaviors suddenly feels safe and seen and heard, and wonderful things can happen. But when you're pushing for that compliance and control, very often that's what pushes the child who's got maybe tremendous potential to do well if properly connected. And I think we all do. We all have a much greater capacity when we feel valued and feel heard. But that kind of traditional mindset that we're here to learn and that's the only priority, I think sometimes is a little counterproductive. Any thoughts?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, even the idea of classroom management, that phrase is such a setup for disappointment for all parties, right?
Mm-hmm.
It conveys such a wrong power dynamic that it immediately puts the precipice upon the adults to do to children,
Right.
and dismisses the child's worth and value in the classroom.
And again, do with, not do
Mhm.
to, not do for. And that seems to be a theme running throughout this as well, is that idea. All right. So let's see what else we have here. All right. So great practical strategies. Okay. Aaron said that, yes, you can do this, and providing no additional supports for someone is just invalidating. Yeah. And again, realizing that because we can do something at one moment in time doesn't mean we can do it all the time.
Right.
And again, back to another step. Sometimes this is where we need support, connection, validation, all the things that you're talking about here throughout this process. That's great.
Mhm.
Let's see. And Claudia said, great content. Thank you for sharing this all with us. So we are on we've already gone through 6, haven't we?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
we're getting to number 7, and right on time too. Our timing's looking really great for this. I feel like, there should be a drum roll. I don't think I have a drum roll here. I mean, somewhere I might have something, but it's probably not a drum roll. But let's get to number 7. So what is number 7 here in the 7 skills?
Yes, and this is the skill that educators and professionals are always the most excited to learn about, but we save it to the end because we really have to make sure that they've mastered the first 6 skills. And it's limit setting. It's the one where they come to a training, they're like, how do I deal with a child that's in crisis or has big behaviors, and I need to manage it, like you said, Guy. This skill helps with power struggles. It helps with redirecting children, all of that type of thing. But you can't do this skill if, like some of the commenters had said, if you're dysregulated, if you don't have your be with attitude, if you aren't well grounded and open to this child. So that requires a lot from the adult. So you have to start from a baseline of being really well grounded and compassionate and in relationship with the child. If the relationship's not there, limit setting is not going to go well. If this is a complete stranger to you, if this is somebody that you haven't really been genuine with, it's going to be a struggle. So that's why we do all the other skills. But limit setting is actually a combination of the skills. So it's the ACT model. And A stands for acknowledge the feeling first. So back to my example of a child that's really escalated. They've got a chair. You can tell they're mad. They're frustrated. You want to acknowledge their feeling first, and you want to say, Susie, I see you are so frustrated right now. You are so mad. And when you're doing this, you're not shouting it over 15 kids. You're not standing above them. You're not, gesturing to them in a way that's very aggressive. You're coming up to them. You're getting down to eye level. You're being present. We call it nose to toes. You're saying, Johnny, I see that you are so frustrated right now. And then you're going to communicate the limit. And the limit in a classroom in a lot of settings is, but the chair's not for throwing. And it's a very funny way of phrasing things, but it's a way that we know that children understand. Instead of saying, don't throw the chair or stop that or quit it, we first acknowledge the feeling, which helps them know that you're cued into what's going on for them. Then you communicate the limit. The chair is not for throwing. And then you target an alternative, which could be, and this is always kind of based on your experience with the child and your relationship with them. You would say to them, but if you want to throw something, you can throw the bean bags, you can throw this paper. You're giving them an alternative that still allows them to express the feeling that they need, but you're not doing it in an unsafe way. So that's ACT, and that's our limit setting strategy.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this. If we're talking, so of course, you painted a scenario here that is not an unfamiliar scenario of things that we see that often lead to things going incredibly badly, that might lead to a kid being restrained or secluded or other things happening. Getting the sense that a child is quite dysregulated at that moment in time where they're holding the chair, knowing that at that point that they are so dysregulated that they are not really necessarily in their cortex. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about this, and there's a bit of this that relies on cortex. So what if the kid is really super dysregulated? I mean, and of course I'm a big, kind of believer that, sometimes in the moment, it's like we have to keep doing all the things we're doing to be able to connect and to co-regulate, mm-hmm. because only through that connection and co-regulation can we get them back to the cortex enough that some of these things will make sense. But how do you, kind of with that ACT approach, knowing that a kid might be really having, as Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Rice might say, flip their lid. How does this work in that case? Or do you need to do something else before you get that limit setting? Because again, if you've got a kid holding a chair, they might be so dysregulated that cortex appeal may not be getting to them. So how do you handle that kind of situation?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the thing, is we don't ever teach limit setting without the first 6 skills. Right. So we're hopeful that in the lead up to that, before their lid is fully flipped, mm-hmm. that you have done something like tracking, that you've summarized, that you've been the be with attitude, and that we know that children respond well to a safe relationship. And so that's why I say ACT won't work with kids that you don't know. Believe me, I've done it, learned the hard way through experience. And that, if a lid is flipped, your presence is going to be the key. So my presence is not big and scary. It's not stomping across the room. It's not moving too fast. It's moving fairly slow. And it is really, I think one of the good case examples I have from that is at one of the schools that I worked at in North Carolina, where there was a seclusion room and they were using physical restraint. How it escalated was the child was supposed to be working on their iPad. The teacher was giving commands from the desk across the room. So they were first humiliating and shaming them in front of the classroom. They were saying, get that done. I told you to have that done 20 minutes ago. Get that done. And then they saw the child wasn't doing it on their iPad. They were engaging in some other activities. The teacher stood up, they came over, they hovered way over this kid. And this is a fairly small child. They're hovering over them and standing over them, and they're pointing.
Adults are so bad at picking up how harmful that is. Like, if I came and hovered over you, or you hovered over, the impact that has on us, yet as adults we'll do it. We'll go in with the harsh face and the tone of voice and hovering above. And that's so threatening. You're just sending that child off into a fight or flight state.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And so I was in the classroom at the same time. That child immediately went into a flight state. So they tried to elope, and then they went and hid under their desk. And what I did was I came and I sat on the floor next to them. I gave them a couple feet, but I could see they were totally moving into a shutdown state, that this was a trauma response. And I sat on the floor and I just used that first A part very gently. I know that you're so frustrated. I know that this is scary for you. And it takes patience. Like, it took me a solid 10 minutes.
So I'm going to say, and I don't mean it's a critical way, you left out a step there, because what you described, you were doing be with before you even got back to that. Yeah. And that's so critical. Not to mention the relationship itself then creates a currency that you have to be able to not dysregulate a kid further who's dysregulated, because this child knows that you're someone that's safe. You have that potential to co-regulate and get them back in their cortex, where they can then process that, that you're trying to do with them in that step. Yeah, that's great. We've got a couple of comments I want to hit here, and then I've got a kind of a challenging question for you here in a second. Okay, so Sydney says, I'm a fully trained play therapist, and I often use child-centered play therapy approach. And actually, Sydney is also a volunteer here with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint and in Canada, and said, please tell you that you're channeling Gary Landreth. She will get that reference. I don't, so you do. That's good. Greatly impressive how Claire is bridging this into the classroom. It's often not very easy to do. Claire is awesome. So you've got a fan here already.
Thank you.
We have a comment here. I love this. I love this from Aaron. I'm taking this to my child's IEP meeting tomorrow. The staff does not know how to appropriately de-escalate. And, I do encourage you, we do these and I think, but, Claire, we've got an audience here that we've got parents, we've got self-advocates, we've got teachers, administrators, paraprofessionals, social workers, occupational therapists. What unites the folks together that are part of our community is kind of that belief that we can do better. And when we do these events, one of my, not so secret motivations is that when we do these, I want people to share them. If you're a parent, share it with your team. If you're a teacher, share it with your parents. These are things we need to share if we're going to change, kind of what's happening. Let's see. Aaron said, this limit setting will not work without the child feeling safe. Right. That's exactly kind of the point that I was trying to get at, is that, if we're not feeling safe, if we're not feeling regulated, and of course, by building upon this foundation and building yourself as a safe, trusted person through that relationship. And this is work that takes time, but it's things that you're building upon. So when you begin to do this, just like any of us, we don't build relationships overnight. We build them by continuing to do the same practices. So great point here. Sydney back saying, you're so right, Aaron. Let's see. No approach works with unregulated adults except restraint seclusion. Yeah. And sends a message that I'm in control. Let's see. All of these things, as she's saying, that ruin it are things that have continued to do to my child. Then it ends up in multiple escalating restraints and claim my child was choosing to be non-compliant. Yeah, I'm sorry that that's the experience that you're having. And very often, one of the things that we see is that, well-intentioned staff not only fail to de-escalate a child who's having a hard time, they're actually co-escalating versus co-regulating. And these are principles that you're talking about here that are really about co-regulating, building relationships, creating safety. That safety piece, which was mentioned earlier, that's foundational. If we don't feel safe, we're not able to be in a place that we're ready to learn. We had one of our volunteers, Jennifer Abinette, had written an article at one point, and I love the title. It was Regulation Before Education, right? We need to be regulated before, this part of us is ready. The cortex is ready to learn. So all of this is fantastic. And we've worked through all 7 of these, and really amazing. It's funny because on a face value, some of these things seem so simple, but it makes such a big difference. And sometimes simplicity is really difficult. It's really difficult to make these shifts because, we're under a lot of pressure. Educators are under a lot of pressure to, whether it be grades or conduct or whatever it may be, to meet certain expectations. So I want to ask you, I said I had a difficult question for you, a hard question for you. And that is that sometimes we begin doing some of the right things, but we continue to do a lot of the wrong things. And the wrong things can be well-intentioned, but can undermine the right things that we're doing. So I'll give you kind of an example here. So if you were to have a school get training in this type of approach, um, are there things that you might tell them to stop doing or to no longer do? And the reason I bring that up is that I think about some of the things that are out there in our classrooms that happen quite commonly, and they're not necessarily intended to do harm, but sometimes are undermining relationships without people even realizing it. So
Hmm.
when we are doing behavior charts, or we have a stoplight
Yes.
chart, or we have things like this, these things are not only not very helpful, but they really change a dynamic. I mean,
Hmm.
if you're saying that, what color you get on your behavior chart is contingent upon, how you doing, you're devaluing a relationship.
Hmm.
That's my opinion. You don't have to agree. You can tell me I'm wrong. But
Oh no.
okay, my question for you is like, these are fantastic things to do. These are fantastic ways to build relationships. Are there key things that, in doing this work that people want to maybe not do or do differently to make sure
Hmm.
that they're not, on one hand, trying to build relationships, but on the other, inadvertently doing
Hmm.
damage to them by creating like a dynamic of power differential,
Hmm.
or whatever it may be? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you read my mind with the
Okay.
behavior charts. Yeah.
Okay.
There's nothing
Okay.
worse than a behavior chart, I think. A lot
Yeah.
of the behavioral approaches, that's been a huge shift in the child psychology field, is we don't use behavioral approaches because we know that just behaviors are telltale signs of more intense things going on for children. And we just have to be
Can
more
you say that about
curious.
3 more times for me here? But and you say that, and I shake my head, and people that are listening shake their heads. But many of these approaches are very prevalent in our schools across the
Mhm.
country. These are things that people are being taught, and even sometimes systemically. We have a lot of things that are contingent upon rewards and consequences, and
Yeah.
not helpful to building relationships. In fact, not helpful for building intrinsic motivation.
Mhm.
So yeah, I don't mean to pause you there, but it's like that's such an important point.
Yeah.
How do we make that shift though?
Yeah, I think it's tackling people's fear because it's something that they've been using for a long time that maybe they feel really well versed in. But I always challenge them, like, has it been successful? And do you feel, as an educator or a professional, that it is aligned with who you are?
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, does your impact match your intent? Right.
Right.
Does what you're hoping to do as an educator match what the impact might be? And sometimes it's easy for those things to become misaligned.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we are nearing about the end of our time here together. That went really, really quickly. I was worried we wouldn't get to all of the seven here, but that went really quickly. I want to give folks a chance if they have any final questions or comments to put those in the chat. This has been really interesting, and I'm sure that we could probably dive in much more deeply into this as well. But again, to recap, we had kind of the seven principles here, which are: be with, tracking, paraphrasing, responding to feelings or motivation, returning responsibility, building esteem, and limit setting. And I do like that limit setting follows up kind of in the rear, because sometimes we often are thinking about the outcomes that we might want versus the outcomes that are really important to make the change. And I think by doing that intentionally, you're building to that point where you're not in a position to be effectively limit setting if you haven't built that relationship.
Right.
I mean, you can do
Exactly.
it. You can do it. Is it going to work? Our behaviors. No, right, right, right. So I love that you've done that there. Um, okay, so getting some comments here in the chat real quick. Dana said, I train staff to be the thermostat, not the thermometer. And that's so
That's
important
great.
because we do, I mean, as adults or educators, control the weather. We're not just responding to it. We have a thank you so much. Oh, I missed this. We'll watch it when posted. Yes, and they're always posted. In fact, you can watch them almost right after we finish here live. You can get them on YouTube, LinkedIn, on Facebook. And of course, you can listen later as an audio podcast. Thank you. Oops. Your biggest fan here. Claire's awesome. I appreciate all of her work. Anastasia, beautiful. Where can I find more information about these seven principles? Is there a place with handouts or something that I could share with my child's team? So
Yeah.
anywhere that people can find resources on this, and we can try to put the link in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. If they Google University of North Texas play therapy, Their website is pretty robust, and they can look on there for not just child-teacher relationship training, but also the parent-child relationship training. They've got some handouts on there. They've got loads and loads of research, and they've got all of the foundational child-centered play
And what university was that?
University of North Texas.
University of North Texas. And maybe Courtney can look that up if she's still back behind the scenes and put something up in the chat to give people a link to where that is. Fantastic. And what if we have a teacher here that wants to, bring an idea about training to their district, or we have a parent that says, hey, I learned a little bit about this in an hour that I spent on a podcast. Where might they go to find actual training that they could get for school or professional development?
Yeah, that's a great question. Depending on where they're at in the country, I would either reach out to the University of North Texas or to the University of North Carolina at Charlotte directly. They have pretty robust programs where they're training graduate students and PhD students, like I was at the time, in this type of thing. I'm also happy if people want to email me, I can help direct you to who I think might be the closest to your regional area.
Okay. Yeah. And I was going to ask you in that vein, do you do any consulting or working with schools or districts? Okay. So they can also contact you potentially as well okay, fantastic. All right. So, teacher training is in my child IEP. Good job.
Great.
That's a thing you can put in your IEP that many people don't realize. I remember learning about that earlier on with my son and putting something in there for a requirement. Really important. This has been a fantastic conversation. It's been great to have you here today. I really, it's fun. We had talked about whether to do a slide deck or have a conversation. This was a really fun conversation to have. So I really appreciate you coming here and spending the time with us. I'm going to wrap up here in a second. You can stick around. We'll end here in a second. But I do want to thank everybody for coming out today and joining us. And as always, do want to remind you, share these events with other parents, with other families, with educators, with administrators. The way we create change is by bringing awareness to things that we can do to, really do better. And one of the core beliefs that we have here at the Alliance is that if you know better, you do better. And I'm a huge proponent in the fact that not only if you know better, can you do better? I'm a huge believer. If you know better, you have an obligation to do better. So I think that's really, really critical as well. So with that, I just want to mention here real quickly. And before I do, I'm just going to ask you, Clara, the question I like to ask people sometimes. And I ask this at the very end of the conversation. But is there anything else you would like to share with us?
No, I just really appreciate you all hosting me and all of the wonderful work that you're doing out there. I think, I believe that we're making big progress in this country and that we just, need to keep pushing forward, And
that's a good message to hear, because sometimes it feels overwhelming, feels like we're not making progress, but I agree with you. And also, of course, we didn't get into much of this, but at some point we'll have to have you back and talk about the work that you're doing it together, because I know you're doing some amazing work there. You talked about kind of your role in working in residential. And of course, in many cases, residential programs are programs that aren't heading in the right direction in many cases. And I remember spending some time talking to you about the work that you were doing. It sounds like you're doing some amazing things and having some fantastic outcomes. So we'll have to think about having you back as well to talk more about that. Do want to let folks know we'll be back again in 2 weeks. And I've actually got another live event in about an hour that I'll be doing. And that's with Advocating for Kids. I'm going to actually be on their show. So if you're around, come join us. I think I've got it linked on the Alliance site as well. But join us again in 2 weeks. We've got Meg Baldwin joining us. We're going to talk about something really exciting: balanced auditory exercise, pattern repetitive rhythmic movements for everyone. I can't talk here at the end of the day, but Meg's got some fantastic things to share with us. So I'm really looking forward to that. So with all of that said, again, want to thank everybody for joining us. Dr. Cronin, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Those of you that are just joining on, make sure you go back and you watch this and share the video. So we'll see everybody again soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.